Hey guys, welcome to the Optimized Army podcast. Today I am joined by a very special guest. He is Russ Scala, and he's the leader of Scala Precision Health based in Florida. And he's also the author of American Biohacker. So Russ, you want to introduce yourself and how are you doing today?
Hey guys, I'm doing really well. I'm so glad, Daniel, to be here and share information with your people.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Russ, you've been on, you're very familiar, you should be familiar to some of the listeners of the show because you've been on several podcasts with Jay Campbell on the TRT Revolution podcast, and he's a great friend of mine. And you actually met up with him the other day at the anti-aging, what's the name of it again? The AAMG in
Yeah, the AAMG. I met Jay and Jim Brown for the first time after all these years of dialogue. So it was great to finally meet them, shake hands, and brainstorm on some ideas.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I have Russ on today is because Russ is a fountain of knowledge of all things health, and every time I talk to Russ, I'm just absolutely fascinated by the depth of the knowledge and the information that you have, and especially the practical experience you've had of being among treating patients of all types with all types of diseases, conditions, and there's not many people out there, I think, that have the kind of understanding of many conditions that Russ has. So I think some of his insights will be really fascinating for people, and I'm definitely looking forward to asking Russ some questions and hearing his answers. Okay, so excellent. So the first thing I wanted to talk about with you, Russ, today was because most of our listeners of the show will be young guys, and I want to ask you what are some of the biggest health issues that you see among young men that attend the clinics that you're in?
Yeah, I see a lot of the younger guys are really struggling with trying to lose weight, and they're doing it the wrong way. And I never want to be the Jehovah's Witness in the room, so I only help people out when they ask me, because I researched marathon runners that why were they so obese when they crossed the finish line, and I was a triathlete for 20 years, and I battled with that in the early 90s. So I try to when these younger when the younger guys in their 20s are trying to lose body fat, it has a lot to do with your microbiome, your intestinal tract. It has to do with the estrogen in the environment. And it's not about calories. I mean, it's not about calories in, calories out. And let me just expand on that a little bit. If you have 300 calories of pure fat, 300 calories of Oreo cookies, and 300 calories of steak, everybody thinks that, according to all the diet people out there, that those calories are all the same. They're just calories. It's a way to measure heat. Well, it's which one of those three things are going to raise your insulin levels. Obviously, the Oreos will shoot your insulin levels up, your fat storing hormones. The steak will elevate it a little bit, and the fat won't elevate it that much at all. And there's a lot of miscommunication with some of the younger generation. A lot of the younger, like I have clients that are in their 20s that have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Wow.
Holy mackerel. Yeah, I mean, that's heartbreaking. We go get them imaged, and then we see the fat in their liver after doing an MRI. Now, we could reverse that, but they have no idea that it's the diet that's elevating insulin that's causing fat to be stored in the liver. And trust me when I tell you, it's the liver that causes heart disease. That the cardiologists of the future are going to be people that focus on treating the liver, because it's those small lipid fractionalizations that damage the artery that are produced when the liver has fat on it. I don't want to lose anybody, but that's going to be the evolution of heart disease. Or actually, heart disease is multifactorial. Even marathon runners and triathletes that I've worked with, even myself, we damaged our hearts doing all this endurance training that we thought was healthy, and it's not.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing, a misconception that people have today is, even when they are overweight, they think it's just a pure, if it fits your macros, calories in, calories out. And of course, as you've just alluded to there, not every calorie is made the same. And another thing there is, I still can't believe it in this day and age that many people think that cardio is the best way to lose weight. Running around, jogging, not only is it not great for your knees and your body as a whole, but it's definitely not the best way to lose weight.
Well, like I said, I gained weight training for a half Ironman triathlon in Panama City, Florida. In 1996, we went on the ketogenic diet, my roommates and all the triathletes. That's when we saw a big difference. Now, we made a lot of mistakes using the higher fat diet and lower in carbs, but I realized early on in '96, because think about it, I left the SWAT team and I stopped being a paramedic. I went back to grad school and I started hanging out with a bunch of triathletes, which I stopped my drinking. I stopped running on emergency calls. My whole body changed. Well, when I changed my community, Daniel, that really saved my life, thank God. But what I didn't realize was all the training that we were doing was damaging my metabolism. It took about 8 years for it to hit me, but you know, I really went in the tank and I suppressed all my hormone levels. I had post-race depression. I mean, we really raced pretty hard. And I thought the more the better. And again, I'm not telling anybody not to do endurance sports. I love the endurance sports to this day. I just make sure that people do it the right way.
Right. Absolutely. It's all about doing it in an educated and informed way. And it's funny that, you know, that people have these misconceptions. I mean, if anything, the internet is supposed to stop these misconceptions, but if anything, it creates even more misconceptions because you have so many differing points of view, right?
Exactly. I think one of the things that we could learn is that all of us are biochemically unique. One vitamin and one medication is not going to work for all of us. One exercise program may not work for all of us. So I tell my clients and my patients, keep a logbook, build a community of like-minded people, experiment, you know, talk to each other. Because in a very short period of time, as you know, Daniel, you can know more than your physician does about your own biology. You know more about your own biology than any physician in a short period of time. And most of the doctors that I've trained, probably over 600 doctors since 2003. A lot of the doctors, when I sit with them, they look at blood work and they treat the blood work. They don't listen to the patient. And I'm sitting there going, listen to the patient. The blood work is normal. Listen to the patient. I'm tired. I'm fatigued. I'm not sleeping. So physicians in our medical community, this is kind of scary. And again, a lot of doctors are on my program. They're friends of mine. But iatrogenic deaths, iatrogenic means death caused by the healer. Iatrogenic deaths in the United States is the third leading cause of death in the United States.
Wow.
I mean, that's pretty scary, bro. So we have to take charge of our own health. You know, the doctors make fun of people that come in and ask them questions. I go, why don't you work with that person as a team? Most doctors have golden handcuffs. They got to see 30 people a day. How are you going to drill down on somebody? And forget about it if you're an athlete. Doctors don't know how to treat endurance athletes or that metabolism. It's just that Joe Rogan educates more people than the American Medical Association with his podcast, as an example. Right? Exactly what we're doing now. What we're doing now, Daniel, is going to go viral because people will say, I'll reach out to Russ and Daniel before I start, taking myself down the wrong road.
That's right. And I think what's happened is many people have lost, for better or for worse, many people have lost trust in physicians because, some physicians do take this, as Eric Topol says in his book, The Patient Will See You Now. The physicians have this paternalistic attitude towards patients, so whereby the doctor's view is, I know best, even though you're the patient, I know best, and unfortunately a lot of doctors have this kind of ivory tower attitude, and in a way you can understand because they've been through 10 plus years of medical school, or maybe more in some cases, so they are experts at what they talk about. But at the same time, you have to realize the patient is the one who's expert in their own body, right? But where's the doctors are very quick to dismiss them and treat them, as you mentioned, as lab work, and that tends to be the default state of being in this day and age, is to treat people based on, as we well know in the TRT community, treating testosterone, treat people as a lab number and treat symptoms secondary. Whereas in the past, they didn't have lab numbers to go off or blood work, so they would have treated patients based on symptoms first, right? So it's kind of gone for, it's inverted.
Yeah, and most of the doctors are in the sickness. They're treating people with 3 or 4 different types of illnesses. The TRT community, like you and myself, we want to stay healthy. We're all about prevention. We know that after about 4,000 or 5,000 hours of medical school training, they have no training in nutrition. We know that people right now are ordering their own lab work. They're forming communities. They're talking to guys like you and I, and they're getting more information than they are at their physician. And I think that's the paradigm that's going to change. the doctors that'll be the early adapters will be working in teams with guys like you and I than what they've done in the past.
Right, I'm with you on that one. One of the points you brought up before was when you were in the SWAT team, and that kind of leads me on to my next question, which is because the SWAT teams share many kind of attributes and what they go through in terms of training and the things they experience as part of their job with military veterans. And I know that you've had experience treating these guys and they've faced many of the similar conditions. And one thing I want to ask you about is because you've had so much experience with treating vets, is what kind of conditions do young veterans tend to go to that you see that come in through your clinics?
Well, one of the things that I see is a lot of them, a lot of these vets, they're put in some horrendous situations that most people can't even imagine. Okay. And there's something called a flashbulb image. When you're on a traumatic scene, instead of you processing information through your hippocampus, it's immediately locked into your long-term storage, these traumatic events. And a lot of these vets are raised by good parents. They're good kids. And then when they come out of boot camp, they may have to kill somebody face to face. And you're not right after that. And we have to almost do a reverse boot camp for these guys. I know physiologically that the young vets that I've worked with and other people that I've consulted, their prefrontal cortex doesn't fully form until they're in their late 20s or 30s. So the military and the police departments, they all take advantage of our enthusiasm and our naivete to get us into a system. And then when something happens to us, when we're broken down, when we went to boot camp with our team and our friends, and we went over to the war zone with our friends, when something happens to us, we're sent home alone. That's crazy. They should be, you know what I mean? So I'm really doing a lot of work on how I can educate the general public and the physicians to better take care of people in high stress environments, because they don't understand it. The war is what people see on TV, playing video games. America hasn't been involved in a major war since World War II. The doctors that are trained in medical school really don't understand what it's like to be in the war zone, where every sense is overwhelmed, where you're constantly in that state of hyper alertness, why you can't come home and go to Beds Bath and Beyond with your wife or girlfriend, dude. So yeah, I'm really took a deep dive into that treatment protocol that I'm with Trent and my guys. I'm going to try to come out with some really important videos so the vets can watch it and maybe take action, like people that hear us today, Daniel. I think it's important. I don't want to medicate these guys with Prozac and Xanax. We could be doing more for them, and TRT is part of the recovery therapy.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Russ. Great answer, by the way. I've spoken to several younger veterans in the past, and I mean, young or old, older guys, to be honest. And when they go to their army doctor or endocrinologist and say, "Oh, I've got the symptoms of low testosterone," and as you know, even in the army, you would expect that they want these guys to be at the height of their physical abilities, right? You would expect that. However, these endocrinologists and doctors in the army, they don't know about these conditions, about low testosterone. So, and like we spoke about earlier, if they see on the blood test that it's quote unquote normal, they're not going to treat these guys. And something that you're very familiar with and you know a lot about is, which I'd like to kind of elaborate on with you, is the relationship that these guys who go through combat they tend to have a lot of cortisol, elevated cortisol, right, and stress.
Right.
And so what happens is that as a result of the elevated cortisol, they tend to have, a lot of these vets have low testosterone and problems with other hormones like growth hormone, thyroid, and everything else, because elevated cortisol interferes or impedes the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is responsible for the production of testosterone. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, Russ, and the relationship between testosterone and cortisol?
Yeah, first of all, a lot of my research, guys, just remember, I've been working on heart attack cases since 1975. As a paramedic, I worked on a lot of cardiac cases, and as a triathlete, I was testing athletes in 1996 on why marathon runners and triathletes were having heart attack stints and bypass surgery when the sport was supposed to be completely healthy. So a lot of my work, and I've been in front of hundreds of cardiologists, they still can't get their head around this. So what I want to tell you, the imbalance of cortisol and testosterone is what damages the lining of your arteries, the endothelial lining. I mean, you could Google that. The imbalance, high cortisol and low testosterone can block your arteries like a 2-pack-a-day smoker. So what could we glean from that? Luckily, when you're in your 20s or your 30s, your hormonal levels are imbalanced, Daniel. But what you said, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, gonadal axis, when you're over in the war zone, that becomes suppressed. So the elevated cortisol not only damages your arteries, but it damages your short-term memory in the hippocampus, and it lowers all your neurotransmitter levels, serotonin, dopamine, and adrenaline. So when vets start having these symptoms, the first thing they do, let's take a page out of the book called Potatoes Not Prozac. They start eating more carbohydrates to elevate their serotonin levels. Makes sense, right? And then they start increasing their sugar content, and their diet goes in the toilet only because they're medicating themselves. And then they start drinking. Alcohol and beer, liquid bread is great for medicating your brain chemistry when your cortisol and testosterone levels are whacked. So for these veterans, I never mess with their diet or any high stress. And it doesn't have to be vets. It could be my buddies, my ex-police officers, or somebody that's going through a divorce. They're in the tank, and they start medicating themselves with food, and they don't realize it. So I have to drip the science on them real slow. I've got to pull the puzzle pieces together when I do high-level interventions right now. That's the only area that I work in. And it just seems to work for me, my stress level. I like to see an outcome of my work. I don't treat hundreds of people. I'm in my hometown. I do consults like with guys like you all over, but I just focus on 11th hour interventions right now. And a lot of that with the vets is they lay their head down on the pillow at night and they can't shut their brain off because they're cycling thoughts. And Daniel, there's something in your brain, a little Pac-Man called monoamine oxidase, that in our 20s used to eat away all the bad thoughts in our heads so we could sleep at night. That disappears when cortisol is elevated, so you start cycling the bad thoughts. Yeah, how about that? Yeah, find me a psychologist or a psychiatrist to talk about that. It's not going to happen, bro. So the science I'm dripping on you right now, Daniel, in a very short period of time, if you run into somebody tomorrow, remember what I said? You could at least get them out of the railroad tracks.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating stuff you're talking about there, Russ. Again, if you went to a psychologist or a counselor, which this happens to a lot of these vets, traditionally there's two types of treatment options for these guys, unless you see someone like yourself, or let's say Dr. Mark Gordon, or Dr. John Chrysler, any one of these caliber doctors. They might treat you the right way, but the traditional routes for these kind of vets are either counseling, speaking to someone, talking about, which has its place, of course, and or
right.
Given SSRIs, antidepressants. So these guys are given these two forms of treatments, but unfortunately the underlying problem here is the hormonal imbalance and the imbalance of elevated cortisol. So and unfortunately, and I really hate to see this, and I know you feel passionate about it as well, that these guys, because they feel like they've got no other option and they don't know what's going on, because they're seeing doctors everywhere who are telling them the same thing, take these pills, they feel like hopeless,
Well, it breaks my heart, because here's another thing that drives me crazy. These guys think that there's something wrong with their brain because of the psychiatrists and the psychologists that they see. This is a multifactorial condition, no different than diabetes or heart disease. This is a wound that nobody can see. Most of these vets coming back, if they had an amputation or a cast on their arm, we would go, oh, we get it. But the mental illness, they don't see. So if you don't see it, you think somebody may be lying or maybe faking it. No, if you're in the war zone and you visually see trauma and you're in there long enough and you suppress your hormonal levels, you elevate your cortisol levels, you're not going to be right. You almost, like I said, you need to go through like a reverse boot camp. But the SSRIs, we really don't know how they work over time. We know Dr. Peter Bregan, who wrote the book Toxic Psychiatry, says that these SSRIs over time damage the prefrontal cortex and they damage impulse control. So these are documented cases, but when they settle out of court with these cases, the non-disclosure is signed where people can't say that how much they won from the pharmaceutical company. So this information is available in the book called Toxic Psychiatry. A lot of the vets, like I say, they come home and they're told by a bunch of different people. It's in their head. Nobody tells them about the gut-brain connection. Nobody tells them about cortisol. Nobody says, listen, I understand what you've been through. Let's up your hormonal levels and let's do a urine sample and test your neurotransmitter levels. Well, guess what? Your dopamine and your serotonin levels are in the tank. Let's get you a little 5-hydroxytryptophan. Let's increase some protein in your diet. Your testosterone levels are in the toilet. Let's optimize you and get you a little testosterone, get you above 500. And tell me how you're feeling in a couple of weeks, and let's tweak your dosing. Come on. Is that hard? No.
Well, it is hard actually, Russ, for some people, because they just don't take the time to. Well, I mean, it's as you say, the disease itself is multifactorial, but there's so much. It's multifactorial in the fact that these guys, they don't know how to treat them because the knowledge is not there. Maybe the inclination is not there, and you know what? There's probably not enough money in it to treat these.
Well, yeah. Well, when I said it wasn't hard, I meant it's not hard for you and I to see it and to explain it to the vet.
Yeah.
Well, what's hard is the bureaucratic system. The one black Model T Ford coming off the assembly line is the treatment protocol for everybody. That's crazy. The DMS-5, the DMS-5 with all the mental illnesses in there, that there was only 100 mental illnesses in the DMS-5 in the 1950s. I think it was called the DMS-1 back then. But in the 1960s, the American Medical Association tried to shut down the psychiatric community because they said that they didn't have any MRIs back then. Most of their studies were done in prisons with people with problems. I'm not saying that people don't have issues, but I'm saying that it can't be treated. Like, why isn't there a blood test for bipolar disorder? I mean, you know what I mean? So the psychiatric community has always done battle with the medical community about trying to find diseases and diagnoses to put a label on somebody to justify their treatment,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it seems to be, unfortunately, that's what modern medicine seems to excel at, is putting incorrect labels on people and treating them incorrectly. But that's the whole topic in and of itself. So that kind of leads me on to my next question, actually, because you talked about the dopamine, serotonin, and all sorts of chemical imbalances that a lot of the veterans have. And I want to talk a little bit now about something that you mentioned in your book, American Biohacker, which I haven't finished yet, but it's a great book, by the way. And for you guys listening, I definitely think you should check Russ's book out. There's a lot of wisdom and really some fascinating insights and stories in there. And in your book, Russ, American Biohacker, you talk about how some people are actually born with low dopamine levels. And interestingly, these people with low dopamine levels can also be, at the same time, very successful in their careers, such as artists, actors, comedians, and scientists. And what happens is when they have, as you talk about in your book, when they have low dopamine levels, oftentimes they become addicted to their careers, and that's why they become so successful in them, because in their careers that kind of gives them that kind of chemical high that's not there because they have such low dopamine levels. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, over the 30-year period, any celebrity that I've worked with, or any high-level athlete, or any creative person, I've worked with people in bands and music writers, and they've always fascinated me. But what I learned is a lot of them, like myself, was born with low dopamine levels, and I didn't notice this, but back when in the early 80s, when I was a paramedic and I was drinking, I would call up my shift and I wanted to come in and run emergency calls because that's where I felt the best. But that's not healthy. And a lot of these war veterans, most of my clients get into trouble when they can't deal with the dead air. It's like if they're playing in front of a million people, or if they're writing a book, or if they're actively engaged in a sport, everything is fine. But if they have low DRD4 genes or low dopamine gene, they can't deal with the dead air, and that's when they get in trouble with the drinking. The ladies, they start banging down oxys because that brain chemistry. They got a very talented brain chemistry. A lot of them get accused of being bipolar, but they're not bipolar. They just could function at a very high level. Like Robin Williams as a comedian is a great example of somebody that could function up here. And then when he came down, everybody thought he had an illness. No, he could be funny and he could be turned on, you know, and have that rapid fire brain chemistry when he was giving, you know, his shows. But when he would come down, the dead air was always a problem. That makes sense.
That makes total sense. And what you mean by, just to elaborate for the listeners, what you mean by dead air is kind of like the downtime that these guys have when they're not doing their thing, like, you know, playing in front of people, writing a book. That's what you mean by dead air, right?
Exactly. Like when I was a triathlete, a lot of the triathletes, when they weren't racing or training, they'd be drinking. So I used to make a joke, say, pick a sport, be an alcoholic or a triathlete. But in reality, they were medicating their brain. And,
Right.
and I was doing the same thing. Yeah, I was doing the same thing. So, you know what, Daniel, what we can glean from that is we have to be very, very aware that highly creative people, you know, they could have low circulating dopamine gene. And these are the kids that get in trouble in school for ADHD. You know, highly creative people don't learn the way we learn. That's what makes them creative. Look at Steve Jobs and the Facebook character, Mark Zuckerberg. They walked out of Harvard. They were way out on the tip of the spear. You know, the low dopamine level drove them to success, but in the long run, you know, it could, you know, I think Steve Jobs was a fruitarian because he had imbalance in his blood sugar levels, and him being a fruitarian compromised his pancreas all those years. Just, you know, you could be very brilliant in one area, but in the other area you could not be. And I'm not shooting anybody down. I sort of look at the histories of these people only to keep myself healthy, because I'm just like, I'm everything I just talked about. So I have to really dial in my health, maintain my testosterone, my growth hormone levels, my thyroid, because I damaged my body not only being on the emergency scene for 20 years, but then becoming a triathlete. I love the sport, but I should have never really picked it up. I just should have maybe gone into the weight room, but it didn't move fast enough for me. The weight room didn't move fast enough. Now I'm fine with it. You know, I don't race or train anymore at that level.
Got you. And what you talked about there, Russ, in terms of the low dopamine and the having a gene for that, how would someone know, for example, well, firstly, how prevalent is this not having the dopamine gene or having low dopamine? And secondly, how would someone know if they have the symptoms of it? I mean, apart from having a blood test, of course, but how would someone know if they had?
You could do a genetic test for low dopamine gene. I'm not sure what the gene is, but I think this is a throwback from our hunting and gathering, you know, our ancestry. I just think that, you know, way back in the day, there was people fine working in the village, building a hut, and there was some guy standing on the beach wanting to build a boat and just go out across the ocean. I really think we are certain, and it doesn't mean we're an illness. We don't have an illness. We just have this quest to create. We have this quest to innovate. I think it's hardwired in some people's DNA. And what breaks my heart is they're medicating these people. These may be the next Steve Jobs, you know, that we're medicating in school now. Are you crazy? We should be, you know, there's a guy that wrote a book called The Edison Gene. Thomas Edison got kicked out of school for ADHD, very high functioning. His mother homeschooled him. Look what happened.
Wow. Yeah. Well, one of the greatest minds of our times was kicked out of school, and they said even back then they said he had ADHD.
Yeah. So right now, if Thomas Edison was around today, they would have medicated him, and he would have been an extra in The Walking Dead.
Yeah. Yeah, he would have been. Yeah, they would have given him. They would have thought he was an unfunctioning, dysfunctional member of
society,
and they would have medicated him. Absolutely. So, another thing that I picked up from your book, Russ, I thought was a really, really interesting point. You mentioned in your book one of the opening paragraphs, you talk about a story about when you were riding in the car with your dad in New Jersey, I think it was. I think you were five years old at the time, correct?
Yeah, I was 5 years old riding in a station wagon with my dad.
Yeah, so sorry, I was going to just say, so what happens is, and I'll let you finish, and you see a guy who gets knocked over by a car, and this guy is kind of twisted and mangled, and you know, he's got blood all over him, and then your father gets out the car, and he you know, he's not like kind of a paramedic or anything, but he gets knocked over. He gets out the car and he tilts this guy's head to the side, and he allows the blood to drain from his lungs, so this guy could breathe again. And once the ambulance arrived, you both got back into the car, and your father simply asked you, "Are you good?" And you were like, "Yeah, I'm good." And then he gets on with his day. For me, that was a fascinating story, and what it means, it's such a simple story. It epitomizes the difference of the kind of the previous generation's attitude, or bygone generation's attitude towards stress, or it's just get on with it. It's a kind of can-do attitude, whereas if that kind of thing happened to many people today, they might be struggle to cope with it, or might be a quivering wreck in the face of it. So my question was to you, do you think that people dealt with stress and had better stress coping mechanisms back then or in previous generations, or is it simply that modern life has got us stressed out and made us unable to deal with stress?
I think I was, my old man was a union leader in Jersey. He's pretty tough. Okay, so you can imagine the way I grew up. My mom was Irish Catholic, and she believed, she never met a stranger. When that guy got hit by a car and flew in front of our car, and like you said, I wasn't traumatized by it. I saw my dad react when everybody didn't, and he did what he had to do, and then we got back in the car. It wasn't like I was paralyzed. I don't know if did that scene lead me into becoming a paramedic? I don't know. But I know that I was raised in a way that, listen, life is fucking hard, and you're going to take a beating. So whether I was on the SWAT team or whether I was at the fire department getting promoted, whether people were dying in my arms, it didn't start taking a toll on me until 10 years in, when my HPA axis got out of balance. That's when I started getting emotional, I mean, I was a lieutenant paramedic on the scene in charge of $1 million of equipment, and this lady screaming that's trapped in a vehicle, she's dying, and all of a sudden I got tears in my eyes. Holy shit. I didn't know what to do. And plus, your guys see any weakness in you during that time, you're done. So I had to wrestle with all that. You know what I mean? And I just think that repeated stress is going to damage all of us. It's just like a marathon runner. You can't run marathons your whole life. You only got a few of them left in you. Just like you can't be a cop, you can't be an emergency worker, you can't be a war veteran or be on a Navy SEAL team and do that consistently. You got a limited amount of time, because physiologically we're going to break down. But I think kids are too protected today. I see, again, I don't have any kids. I'm not married. I do this, Daniel, 24/7. It's just my mission. But I see parents that, they really, their kids are going to be in for a rude awakening when they get out in the real world. Like if a kid's got to, sign up for the military, and the way he's being raised right now, I don't know if they're going to be able to handle that, bro.
Yeah. I mean, some great points there, Russ. I mean, the way that people were raised back then, and compared to now is completely different. I mean, I have my theories on this, and maybe you can give your take on that. But my theory is from, if your father's generation and your generation to some extent as well. What happened was they knew the adversity from the Great Depression, World War I, World War II. So they knew what hard times were, right? So they kind of had this experience ingrained, and that kind of affected them, and that kind of affected their outlook on life and their philosophy towards life. So they had to be harder and tougher, right? Whereas today's generation, we've kind of in many ways, we've benefited off the back of what previous generations have done. And so therefore we haven't had to really go through, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, we haven't had any major wars, at least not in Western world since World War II. So we haven't had to face this kind of adversity that previous generations had. And I think that's had a massive knock-on effect.
Can you imagine an Afghanistan kid meeting a kid here in America, and they're, after they both were raised probably to the age of 10, and the kid in America has been getting participation trophies, and the Afghanistan kid's been in the war zone?
Worlds apart.
Just saying, man. Exactly. It's crazy. And again, I'm not shooting anybody down. I just think that, in life there are winners and losers. I wish it wasn't that way. It's hard, and I'm glad I had bullies in school, because when I met bullies when I was in the police academy, I knew how to handle it.
Yeah, right. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Eventually.
Boom. I mean, it's a cliche everybody uses, but in my life, it saved my life.
Absolutely. There's something that you talked about there, Russ, which I think is a final point we can talk about in the podcast, which I think was really interesting. You talked about, you gave the example of veterans and SWAT guys and guys in the police force, about how they're doing these things day in, day out, and the stress has a really detrimental effect on their bodies. I know one thing that you talk about in your book, and you're very fond of this, is psychoneuroimmunology. So what that means is mental and emotional stress can weaken your immune system. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Russ?
Yeah, psychoneuroimmunology. I always, I got to give credit to Dr. Sapolsky, who wrote the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and his recent book called Behave. I've been following that guy for 30 years. He's a PhD out of Stanford. He talks about psychoneuroimmunology, how elevated cortisol, being in a stressful environment, lowers your immune system. And he's spot on. And we don't understand that. We don't understand that shift work, just being in shift work, is going to accelerate cancer and heart disease in our emergency service personnel all over the world when you have interrupted sleep patterns. It's like, they don't give a shit. The information's out there. Nobody talks about it. Social neurobiology, your immediate, I always say, show me your 3 friends, I'll show you your health. Daniel, with all the fancy stuff we're talking about, if you're hanging out with energy vampires, they're going to kill you too. So you've got to really pick your friends who you hang out with. And again, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but for you to maintain your health, if you're a war veteran or a police officer, you've got to be diverse in your thinking. Working as a police officer and then hanging out with police officers, not a good thing. I did that. Not good. And again, I'm not shooting down the police officers. These guys know I take care of them, and I just see these things happen over a period of time. And, the diversity of our behavior, the diversity of our immediate community. You could read Sebastian Junger's book called Tribes, how important our tribe is to help us get through the day. Like when you lay your head down on the pillow at night and you got stuff going on, wouldn't it be nice to have at least 2 friends that you could at least rely on that will be at your door?
Of course it would. Absolutely. I'm really with you on that one, Russ. Social immunology, I mean, is a massive thing. They say that you are the average of the 5 people that you spend most time with, but you're quite right in that your health is the average of the people that you spend the most time with. And people actually rarely consider that. They consider friendship and people who they spend time with in terms of how it reflects on their life and their success in life, but rarely do people consider that the people that they come into contact with also has a dramatic effect on their health as well. So
exactly. I think one of the gifts that was delivered to me, I'm not real spiritual, but becoming a paramedic really early in my life and having people die in my arms, when I get up tomorrow morning, I'm fucking thankful that my feet hit the ground, bro. I'm just saying. I am. Right? And anybody that comes out of that war zone and they're home, they're thankful, but we just need to take care of them because they don't have the toolbox, brother.
Exactly. And that's why we've got people like, thankfully, we have people like you and me. We're spreading the message, for the people can really, hear this information and understand that there is hope, and that it's not just about the sick care model is going to throw pills at them or, and try and give them all sorts of stupid treatment that's not going to work for them. It's about getting the right information and, because there is a solution. And so that kind of wraps it up from my side, Russ. Yeah, absolutely. Again, as always, when I talk with you, it's an absolute pleasure. Fascinating. I'm sure we could talk for hours because you've got so much wisdom and insight to share. And if people want to learn a little bit more about you, Russ, we talked about your book, which I really think people should read. There's the American Biohacker, and that in there you talk about your history as a paramedic and the SWAT team and how you got into this business. But if people want to learn a little bit more about you, Russ, where can they find you?
Well, what I did is I started the Russ Scala YouTube channel, Daniel, and I make videos with my team, and I put them up on the YouTube channel so people could watch them. I've got war veterans up there. I've got college presidents. I've got rock stars. I got people that were really in bad shape that we helped turn around, and I just put it up there for people at no cost just to watch it. Maybe it'll stimulate ideas. I mean, what stimulated you, bro?
What got me? That's a good.
See?
That's a great question. So what got me into all this? So the guys listening to this may or might not know, I'm also writing a book at the moment. It's going to be out in the middle of this summer. It's called Optimized Under 35, and you can check out optimizedunder35.com and get on the list to be the first to know about when it comes out. But in my book, we're going to talk about all the topics, some of the topics, not all of them, because Russ is the expert in some of these topics that me and Russ talked about in this podcast. But what got me into this whole thing is that, I had low testosterone myself. So again, like you, Russ, I talk about things that I have experience in, and, and I experienced that, and I was down in the dumps with low testosterone, and no doctor would treat me. I felt like shit, and I didn't know where to go. And fortunately, I had some information out there, and the information out there was my friend Jay Campbell. He helped me and mentored me. But at the time when I went through it 3 years ago, there was not very much out there, and young guys still have the same problems today about getting treated. Oh my God, my doctor won't treat me. He says I'm too young. I'm under 35. I'm 18, or however old they are, because the doctors don't want to treat them because they're so young. And this is the reason I wrote this book, is because so young guys have access to this information and know, like you talked about the military vets, that they're not alone and they can get treated.
Well, I think, Daniel, here you go. You explained what you and I did today. Your story is so important for young men, and I'm glad you're writing a book. But you had to go through the trauma of low testosterone and not get answers. And then look what you did. Did you stop there? No, you wrote a book. And now you have a podcast. And this is, I'm telling you, Daniel, when people hear what we're doing, there may be a couple of war vets out there that maybe start a podcast and focus on the physiology of PTSD. We don't know what's going to happen, bro. This is all new. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, is what we're doing right now.
Excellent. I'm with you on that one, Russ. And that's why we spoke today. So thank you very much for your time today, Russ. And looking forward to the next time we have you on the show.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Russ.